Imagine stepping into worlds painted long before films brought fantasy alive truly. The artists behind these visions shaped imagination across generations and cultures worldwide. Their brushstrokes created legends that still define fantasy art today globally forever. From dragons to warriors, every canvas tells an unforgettable mythical story epic. Fantasy art bridges reality and imagination through powerful visual storytelling techniques used. These masterpieces continue inspiring movies, games, and literature even today worldwide constantly. Legendary artists like Frazetta redefined fantasy strength, mood, and atmosphere completely forever. Their works often blend realism with surreal dreamlike elements and emotions deeply. Modern fantasy owes much to these pioneering visual storytellers of imagination art. Each painting invites viewers into realms beyond ordinary human perception, boundaries, limits. Artists such as Boris Vallejo popularized heroic fantasy imagery in books' covers. Their depictions of muscular heroes shaped popular fantasy aesthetics for decades globally. Frank Frazetta's iconic style influenced countless illustrators and filmmakers across generations deeply. His compositions often capture raw power, motion, and dramatic intensity vividly, perfectly. Fantasy artwork frequently reflects mythologies from various ancient cultural traditions worldwide deeply. These influences create timeless visuals that continue to resonate strongly today deeply. Brian Froud's fairy illustrations brought mystical creatures into vivid existence, beautifully, artfully. Alan Lee's landscapes inspired cinematic interpretations of Middle-earth imagery worldwide, influential today. John Howe's detailed work defined architectural fantasy environments for films beautifully globally. These artists collectively built the foundation of modern fantasy visual culture today. Their artworks continue influencing game design, concept art, and storytelling today globally. Fantasy illustrators use lighting and color to create emotional depth effectively today. These artworks often transport viewers into immersive mythological storytelling worlds completely vividly. The emotional intensity in fantasy art creates lasting impressions on viewers deeply. Many modern fantasy movies borrow heavily from classic painted compositions directly today. These influences can be seen in blockbuster films and fantasy games constantly. Fantasy art also preserves cultural myths and ancient storytelling traditions globally today. Each artwork reflects the imagination of its creator in unique ways distinctly. The evolution of fantasy art mirrors technological and cultural progress closely worldwide. Digital tools have expanded possibilities for modern fantasy illustration artists greatly today. Yet traditional painting techniques still influence contemporary fantasy compositions strongly today deeply. Fantasy art often requires blending imagination with detailed anatomical accuracy, carefully, consistently. Lighting techniques dramatically enhance mood and depth in fantasy illustrations vividly today. Many fantasy worlds originate from sketches before becoming full paintings later completely. Artists often draw inspiration from mythology, literature, and personal dreams deeply constantly. These inspirations create layers of meaning within fantasy visual storytelling richly deeply. Fantasy art exhibitions showcase evolving styles across different generations of artists globally. Collectors highly value original fantasy paintings from renowned artists worldwide today deeply. Fantasy art continues evolving while preserving its deep historical roots strongly today. The legacy of fantasy illustration shapes modern entertainment industries globally today forever. Viewers often feel emotionally connected to fantasy art narratives instantly today deeply. The imagination required for fantasy art pushes creative boundaries further constantly beyond. Iconic fantasy scenes often become cultural symbols across generations, worldwide today deeply. These artworks reflect humanity's fascination with myths and heroic legends deeply forever. Fantasy artists frequently experiment with scale, perspective, and dramatic lighting techniques boldly. The emotional storytelling in paintings enhances viewer engagement significantly today, deeply always. Many fantasy worlds feature complex ecosystems and magical civilizations vividly imagined always. Artists use symbolism to convey deeper meanings within fantasy compositions effectively today. These works often require years of dedicated artistic development and patience always. Fantasy illustrations help audiences escape reality and explore imagination freely, always deeply. The emotional connection between viewer and artwork defines fantasy impact strongly deeply. Fantasy art often inspires storytelling across books, films, and games widely today. Many artists draw heavily from dreams and subconscious creative visions, deeply constant. The journey into fantasy art deepens as we explore its hidden storytelling power. Every iconic painting begins with a spark of imagination inside the artist's mind. These sparks often come from dreams, myths, and deeply personal emotional experiences. Artists translate invisible thoughts into vivid worlds filled with life and mystery. One famous example is Frank Frazetta's barbarian worlds full of raw energy. His paintings often feel like frozen moments from epic untold ancient legends. Viewers instantly feel tension, movement, and emotion captured within a single frame. This emotional intensity is what separates fantasy art from ordinary illustration work. Boris Vallejo also shaped fantasy storytelling through hyper-detailed heroic compositions and scenes. His characters often embody strength, beauty, and mythological perfection combined together visually. These artists did not just paint images, they built entire emotional universes. Each brushstroke carries intention, guiding the viewer deeper into imagined realities. Fantasy art often mirrors human struggles through symbolic battles and mystical creatures. Dragons, warriors, and gods represent deeper emotional and psychological human experiences. This symbolic language makes fantasy art universally relatable across different cultures globally. Alan Lee's landscapes show how environment can tell stories without dialogue. His misty mountains and ancient ruins feel alive with forgotten histories. These visuals later influenced cinematic masterpieces like epic fantasy film worlds. John Howe expanded this vision with intricate architectural fantasy structures and designs. Together, they shaped the visual identity of modern cinematic fantasy storytelling. Behind every masterpiece lies countless hours of sketching, refining, and reimagining ideas. Artists constantly revise their compositions to achieve emotional balance and dramatic impact. Lighting becomes a powerful storytelling tool in fantasy illustration compositions and scenes. Shadows often create mystery, tension, and emotional depth within painted environments. Color palettes are carefully chosen to evoke mood, atmosphere, and narrative tone. Warm tones suggest life, energy, and heroic triumph in fantasy storytelling. Cooler tones often represent danger, sadness, or mystical unknown realms beyond reality. This emotional coding helps viewers subconsciously understand story elements instantly and clearly. Fantasy artists frequently study real-world anatomy to ground their imaginary characters realistically. This balance between realism and imagination creates believable yet magical worlds. Many legendary artworks began as small pencil sketches in personal notebooks. These sketches evolved gradually into complex paintings filled with detail and emotion. Some artists spend months perfecting a single composition before final completion. This dedication reflects their deep passion for storytelling through visual media. Fantasy art often requires merging multiple references into a single coherent vision. Mythology, history, and personal imagination blend seamlessly within these creative works. The result is a visual language that feels both ancient and timeless. Viewers often lose track of time while exploring these detailed fantasy worlds. Each painting invites repeated viewing, revealing new details every single time. This layered complexity is what makes fantasy art endlessly fascinating and enduring. Many artists describe their process as discovering worlds rather than creating them. This mindset transforms painting into exploration rather than simple technical execution alone. Fantasy illustration becomes a journey of uncovering hidden narratives within imagination. Some artworks are inspired by personal struggles and emotional transformation experiences. These emotional foundations give fantasy art its deep resonance and authenticity. Without emotion, even the most detailed painting would feel empty and lifeless. That is why storytelling remains central to every great fantasy artwork. Even digital fantasy art today follows these traditional storytelling principles closely. Technology enhances execution, but does not replace creative imagination and vision. Modern tools allow artists to experiment with lighting, texture, and composition freely. Yet the core artistic principles remain unchanged across generations of illustrators. Fantasy art continues evolving while preserving its emotional storytelling foundation strongly intact. Many contemporary artists pay homage to Frazetta, Vallejo, and early pioneers. Their influence can be seen in video games and animated films today. Entire fantasy franchises borrow visual themes originally painted decades ago by masters. This demonstrates the lasting cultural impact of early fantasy illustration pioneers. Even book covers today still reflect classic fantasy composition techniques widely used. Heroes are often placed centrally to symbolize strength and narrative im. The deeper truth behind fantasy art begins revealing itself right now. Finally, fantasy artworks are not escapes, but mirrors of human consciousness itself, always. Every dragon warrior and realm symbolizes hidden parts of ourselves deep within minds. Artists translate subconscious thoughts into visual mythologies we instantly recognize deeply today. These mythologies reflect fears, dreams, and collective emotional memory across human history. Always fantasy art therefore becomes psychology, painted through imagination and color theory. Expressed visually, this perspective changes everything we thought we knew about fantasy art deeply. Suddenly, every painting becomes a psychological map of human experience, revealed clearly. Look closer, and you will notice patterns repeating across artworks worldwide always. These patterns reveal universal truths about fear, hope, and desire. Human nature. Fantasy artists unknowingly document human psychology through symbolic storytelling forms, deeply always. Every brushstroke becomes a coded message from imagination to viewer mind. Decoded, this hidden language explains why fantasy art feels emotionally powerful, always deeply. It connects directly with subconscious emotions we rarely understand consciously within us. That is why fantasy art stays unforgettable across generations. Worldwide forever, truly, because it speaks language beyond words, logic and ordinary reality itself. Always. Now, a deeper twist emerges that changes everything we assume before now. What if fantasy art is not created but discovered instead? Always, truly, artists may simply be translators of worlds already existing within imagination realms. Always, these worlds might exist in collective unconscious, shared by humanity, deep within mind. Fantasy art then becomes exploration, rather than invention, alone, ever seen before. This idea transforms artists into explorers of unseen dimensions within creative mind. Every artwork becomes a portal into parallel imaginative existence, realms beyond perception. Viewers unconsciously travel through these worlds while observing paintings deeply emotionally, always. This explains emotional reactions. People feel toward fantasy imagery, instantly, strongly always. The twist reveals fantasy art is shared dream language of humanity itself. Each painting captures fragments of collective imagination across time, continuously evolving always. This shared imagination connects every viewer to ancient storytellers deeply across ages. Fantasy art becomes bridge between memory myth and identity, human experience itself. Suddenly artists appear less like creators and more interpreters of reality always. Their role shifts from inventing worlds to revealing them clearly, deeply always. This revelation changes how we appreciate every fantasy masterpiece forever, deeply always. We begin seeing paintings as psychological maps of humanity itself, revealed always. Each creature represents fear, desire, or inner transformation within human psyche, always. Even landscapes symbolize emotional states and subconscious memories hidden within mind realms. Fantasy battles represent internal conflicts within human psychology, deeply understood, always today. Dragons often symbolize overwhelming fears or powerful emotions within human experience. Always heroes represent aspirations, courage, and idealized versions of self, human nature revealed. Villains embody chaos, shadow aspects, and suppressed emotions within psyche, always deeply. Thus, every fantasy artwork becomes psychological storytelling at core level, always deeply. This insight reveals why fantasy art resonates across cultures universally, today, always. Because human imagination shares similar emotional architecture everywhere across humanity itself, always. Fantasy art becomes language of shared emotional experience globally, forever, deeply always. This language transcends geography, culture, and historical boundaries, completely universally, always deeply. Now, the final realization begins to fully emerge within understanding, always deeply. Fantasy art was never about escape, but recognition of self-truth, always. We see ourselves reflected in every mythic composition, deeply within art, always. Artists unknowingly map the human mind through imagery expression, always deeply created. Every fantasy world becomes psychological mirror of humanity itself, revealed, always deeply. This mirror forces us to confront hidden inner truths within consciousness, always. That is why fantasy art feels so personal to every viewer always. Because it reflects parts of ourselves. We ignore daily life, always deeply. Fantasy art, therefore, becomes a form of self-discovery through imagination, always. The twist concludes with a profound emotional understanding.